horribly deadly fentanyl in particular is, this has to have just the highest sense of urgency.
All the drugs just in the last month that have been taken off the street. 58,000 kilos of cocaine. Think about a big backyard swimming pool. That would fill 1.5 swimming pools.
At approximately 8:30 in the morning, what appeared to be a routine roadside inspection unfolded on a quiet stretch of Interstate 40. The truck was stopped without incident. The paperwork matched the manifest. The vehicle met safety standards. Nothing about the situation suggested it would become anything more than a brief delay in a long-haul delivery. The deeper analysts looked, the more disturbing the picture became. This was not a case of drugs being smuggled around the logistics system. They were being transported through it, embedded within routine commerce, protected by the very processes designed to ensure efficiency and trust. Federal officials soon realized that standard safeguards had not failed. They had functioned exactly as intended. Weight limits were respected, schedules aligned, freight blended seamlessly. Nothing appeared suspicious because nothing broke the rules. This was the moment the investigation fundamentally changed. What began as a narcotic seizure evolved into a question about control. Had a criminal organization merely infiltrated a trucking company, or had it learned how to quietly operate one from the inside? The distinction mattered because the latter suggested a level of planning and sophistication rarely seen in domestic trafficking cases. Investigators now faced a far more dangerous possibility. If this shipment was not an exception, then it was a signal evidence of a larger system operating in plain sight. And if that system existed, the cocaine found on Interstate 40 was likely only a fraction of what had already passed through unnoticed. By the end of that first day, federal authorities understood one thing clearly. This was no longer about a single truck or a single load. It was about uncovering how deeply criminal networks could embed themselves inside the infrastructure that keeps the American economy moving. And once that realization took hold, there was no turning back. For years, transnational freight services looked exactly like the kind of company investigators rarely scrutinize. Its trucks ran day and night across American highways, carrying food, industrial components, retail products, and everyday goods that kept supply chains intact. With hundreds of tractors in operation, thousands of employees, and contracts stretching coast to coast, the company projected scale, stability, and professionalism. Industry reports described it as efficient. Regulators saw nothing unusual. Competitors saw nothing threatening. There were no public scandals, no labor crises, no regulatory alarms. That clean profile became its greatest defense. Then federal inspectors opened the trailer. When federal agents traced the cocaine seizure back to transnational freight services, the initial expectation was narrow. Investigators assumed they would uncover a single compromised driver or perhaps a small internal breach. These cases were familiar. They followed predictable paths and ended quietly. This one did not. As analysts widened their review, inconsistencies began to surface, not violations, but patterns that felt deliberately engineered. Ownership records revealed layers of corporate entities that appeared lawful on paper, yet obscured real control. Financial filings showed transactions that followed every regulation while revealing very little about who ultimately benefited. Nothing was illegal, everything was intentional. The deeper investigators dug, the more the company stopped looking infiltrated and started looking acquired. Federal reporting later confirmed that transnational freight services had not been overtaken through violence threats or intimidation. Instead, control had shifted gradually through shell corporations, proxy executives, and structured financial moves designed to avoid attention. Each step appeared routine, each transfer looked legitimate. By the time authorities noticed irregularities, the system was already embedded. This distinction mattered. The company was not being used against its will. Its structure had become the mechanism. That realization reframed the entire investigation. The trucks were no longer just vehicles. They were access. The warehouses were no longer storage facilities. They were distribution nodes. The company's reputation was no longer incidental. It was camouflage. According to federal filings, later unsealed, dozens of drivers were knowingly participating, operating inside a system that rewarded silence and reliability. At least 23 warehouses across 14 states were quietly repurposed, functioning as covert hubs where legal freight and illegal narcotics moved through the same logistical channels. Behind what was supposed to be legitimate commercial freight, they discovered hundreds of kilograms of tightly packed cocaine. The quantity alone was staggering, but the real shock arrived seconds later when investigators identified the company that owned the truck. This was not a small carrier operating on the margins of the industry. It belonged to one of the largest trucking companies in the United States. Because the company handled massive volumes of legitimate cargo illicit shipments blended almost perfectly. Nothing stood out, nothing broke pattern. This was not random smuggling, it was industrialized trafficking. At this stage, federal officials stopped describing the case as a drug investigation. It became a supply chain integrity crisis. A criminal organization had learned how to weaponize American infrastructure without triggering alarms. It did not hide outside the system. It hid inside it using paperwork contracts and routine to move cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl across the country. The implications were far larger than one company. If a multi-billion-dollar logistics firm could be quietly absorbed and repurposed this deeply, then the vulnerability was not limited to transnational freight services. It extended to the very assumptions underlying modern commerce. The investigation now faced a new and far more dangerous question. If this network was operating undetected for years, how many similar systems might still be moving beneath the surface untouched and unseen? The investigation reached a decisive shift when federal analysts stopped treating the case as a cargo problem and began treating it as a human one. Instead of focusing on what was being moved, they focused on who was moving it. Driver rosters, route assignments, delivery schedules, and GPS records were layered across months of operational data. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Each driver followed approved routes. Each delivery met timing expectations. Each record aligned with company policy. The pattern only emerged when everything was viewed together. Out of roughly 400 drivers employed by transnational freight services, 89 were not simply unlucky or manipulated. They were knowingly involved. Their routes repeated with unusual consistency. Their schedules aligned with specific warehouses. Their movements overlapped in ways that suggested coordination, not coincidence. That single discovery instantly transformed an ordinary inspection into the starting point of one of the most significant federal investigations in recent American history. This was not a handful of bad actors. It was a system. Federal investigators recognized the implication immediately. Smuggling operations usually rely on secrecy, improvisation, and speed. This network relied on discipline, repetition, and silence. Drivers were rotated to reduce exposure. Loads were calculated to remain beneath inspection thresholds. No single individual appeared essential. Redundancy was built in. At the same time, attention shifted from the road to the infrastructure supporting it. Warehouses connected to the company's logistics network began appearing repeatedly in route analyses. These facilities spread across 14 states looked ordinary from the outside. By day, they handled consumer goods. By night, they served a second function. They were distribution hubs. Legal freight and illegal narcotics moved through the same doors, onto the same pallets, and into the same trailers. This overlap erased the visual and procedural cues inspectors depended on. Nothing appeared out of place because everything belonged. As investigators mapped these connections, a national picture began to form. Drugs entered the United States through commercial channels near the southern border, then flowed into company-controlled warehouses. From there, shipments fanned outward toward major logistics centers, cities chosen for infrastructure access and population density. This was not random geography, it was design. At first, authorities approached the seizure as an isolated incident. The working assumption was familiar: a compromised driver, a one-off smuggling attempt, an internal breach that could be contained. These cases happen. They are investigated, prosecuted, and closed. Court records later showed that once narcotics reached these hubs, they were broken into smaller loads and redistributed rapidly. What appeared to be long-haul freight was in reality the backbone of a nationwide distribution system operating in plain sight. At this stage, the FBI stopped thinking in terms of seizures and arrests. The problem was no longer individual crimes, it was architecture. Every element of the network was built to withstand disruption. If one driver was removed, another replaced them. If one route was delayed, another compensated. No single shipment mattered enough to expose the whole. The system did not depend on secrecy, it depended on flow. That realization forced investigators to confront the true scale of the threat. This was not a cartel sneaking drugs into trucks. It was a logistics operation modeled after corporate supply chains optimized for reliability rather than speed. Federal officials began describing the case not as trafficking, but as a national supply chain vulnerability. A criminal organization had learned how to move like a corporation using American infrastructure as cover. By the time analysts finished mapping the routes, drivers, and warehouses, one conclusion was unavoidable. Stopping this network would require more than arrests. It would require dismantling an entire system at once. And that meant the most dangerous phase of the investigation was still ahead. By the time federal authorities understood the full structure of the network, one fact became impossible to ignore: acting quickly would guarantee failure. The scale of the operation had outgrown traditional enforcement logic. This was no longer a case where seizing drugs or arresting drivers would dismantle the threat. Doing so would only fracture the surface while leaving the core intact. Worse, premature action would alert those controlling the system, allowing them to disappear, relocate, or rebuild elsewhere. But this case refused to fit that pattern, so the FBI made a decision that carried enormous risk. They chose to wait. According to federal filings later released, investigators allowed the network to continue operating for years while it was monitored in silence. Every shipment that moved added data, every route reinforced patterns, every payment revealed another layer of control. This was not delay, it was containment through observation. Analysts collected freight manifest GPS records, driver logs, and warehouse transfer data across dozens of states. When layered together, the information exposed something far more serious than drug trafficking. It revealed a privately controlled logistics system capable of moving large volumes of illegal narcotics across the United States without triggering alarms. At this stage, federal officials began formally treating the case as a national security issue. The concern extended beyond drugs. A criminal organization had effectively gained operational control over critical transportation infrastructure. The same routes used to move food, medical supplies, and industrial goods were being used to distribute cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl at scale. The implication was stark. If this network remained active, it represented a persistent vulnerability inside the US supply chain, and if it could be replicated, the risk multiplied. Internal FBI assessments emphasized restraint. Investigators were instructed to avoid visible enforcement actions that might signal surveillance. Even routine inspections risked exposing the operation. Wiretaps were authorized only after prosecutors established clear layered links between drivers, warehouse managers, financial intermediaries, and corporate controllers. Human intelligence was deployed cautiously. Undercover operatives did not attempt to disrupt operations. Their task was verification, confirming routines, identifying roles, and validating data already captured digitally. When agents began tracing the truck's previous routes, shipment history, and inspection records, they found no obvious irregularities. The vehicle had passed inspections before, its routes were common, its documentation was clean. Everything about its movement suggested compliance, not deception. Every step was designed to preserve invisibility. By late 2024, the accumulated intelligence painted a complete picture. 89 drivers operating in coordination, 23 warehouses across 14 states functioning as distribution hubs, financial flows routed through shell companies designed to conceal true ownership. The network was not fragmented, it was unified. What remained was timing. Federal leadership concluded that staggered arrests would fail. The system was resilient by design. Remove one component and others would compensate. The only viable option was total disruption: drivers, warehouses, financial controllers, and corporate fronts taken down simultaneously. Planning shifted from investigation to execution. Across multiple federal agencies, teams began coordinating warrants, arrest schedules, and seizure orders down to the minute. No action would be taken until every jurisdiction was ready. No signal would be sent until the entire system could be struck at once. To the outside world, nothing changed. Trucks continued to move, warehouses continued to operate, money continued to flow. But internally, the investigation had crossed its final threshold. This was no longer about uncovering a hidden network. It was about deciding the precise moment to collapse it. At 5:03 a.m., while most of the country was still asleep, the operation began. That contradiction raised an uncomfortable question. If a shipment of this scale could move undetected inside a legitimate freight operation, then the problem was not concealment alone, it was systemic. There were no press briefings, no sirens echoing through city streets. Federal teams moved quietly and simultaneously across 18 states, executing a plan that had taken years to build. Every warrant was activated at once. Every arrest team moved on schedule. Every target had already been isolated. This was not a raid. It was a shutdown. Within minutes, 89 truck drivers were taken into custody, many at terminals, rest stops, or their homes, before any warning could spread through the network. At the same time, agents secured 23 warehouses tied to the operation, cutting directly into facilities that had long appeared to be ordinary distribution centers. Speed was essential. Any delay could have allowed data to be erased or assets to disappear. Inside the warehouses, investigators found confirmation of what years of surveillance had suggested. Hidden compartments built into standard commercial trailers, pallets containing narcotics staged alongside legitimate freight, digital records and ledgers detailing movements, payments and assignments across state lines. The scale was unprecedented. Federal prosecutors later confirmed the seizure of approximately 18 tons of cocaine, 4 tons of methamphetamine, and hundreds of kilograms of fentanyl, along with tens of millions of dollars in cash and assets. These numbers did not reflect a single shipment or a lucky interception. They represented the collapse of an entire distribution system in one coordinated strike. More importantly, the arrests did not target street-level traffickers. They dismantled the logistics backbone itself. Financial records seized during the operation exposed shell companies and layered ownership structures that had quietly controlled the trucking firm for years. What once appeared to be a legitimate corporate hierarchy was revealed as a facade designed to shield criminal authority behind contracts and compliance paperwork. As the inquiry widened, investigators stopped focusing on the cocaine itself and began examining the structure that carried it. The trucking company operated hundreds of vehicles nationwide, moved massive volumes of legal goods, and maintained warehouses across multiple states. Its scale, once considered a strength, now became a potential shield. With that structure removed, the company could not survive. Operations halted almost immediately. Assets were frozen or liquidated under court supervision. The brand vanished from American highways, not through scandal, but through erasure. What had once looked like a powerful logistics empire was hollow without the system hidden inside it. In the months that followed, the impact extended far beyond one case. Federal agencies reported a sharp decline in large-scale narcotics movement through commercial trucking corridors. Oversight tightened, financial vetting of corporate acquisitions intensified, supply chain security, once treated as a regulatory concern, was reframed as a national security priority. The lesson was unmistakable. Modern criminal networks no longer rely solely on secrecy or violence. They exploit normality. They embed themselves inside systems built on trust, efficiency, and scale. When those systems are compromised, the damage is not limited to drugs or profit. It threatens the integrity of infrastructure millions depend on every day. This case proved that such networks can be dismantled, but only through patience, coordination, and a willingness to see beyond surface legitimacy. The question that remains is not whether this operation succeeded, it is whether it was unique. If one logistics network could operate in plain sight for years without detection, how many others remain unseen, moving quietly, legally, and invisibly until the next routine inspection opens the wrong door?